Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Brahim Aude, and our topic is Palestine, occupation or independence. And tonight we have two special guests, George Hudis, who has just returned from Palestine and Israel, and also Ramses Lutfi. Both are members of Friend of Sabil. It's an organization that promotes peace in the Middle East, especially between the Palestinians and the Israelis. So welcome. And I just wanted to start with you, George, by telling us some impressions about your trip to Palestine, Israel.
Well, primarily sad. I found it a very sad place. We spent some time in the territories. We were helping to, I use the word help in parentheses, helping to pick olives in the village of Sawiya in the Nablus area. And then we went to Hebron, where we visited with the Christian peacemaker teams and representatives of some Palestinian organizations and stayed overnight there. And the situation, while I had read a great deal before going there, still being there, it's a horrible situation. Just for example, where the Palestinian olive groves are, typically one has a situation where on the hills above the olive groves are the Israeli settlement outposts, or the settlements themselves, and from which they throw rocks on the Palestinians when they try to pick their olives. They cut down their olive trees, they attack the pickers.
These are the settlers, civilians.
These are civilian settlers, and the Israeli Defense Forces are sometimes present. Our presence there was coordinated through an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights. They've been trying to get some protection for the Palestinian families when they pick their olives from the settlers. So there were IDF troops where we were. There were 3 soldiers there. But the result of it was they said, well, we don't want you picking the top third of the olive groves, because then you're getting close enough to the settlement outpost, because then they'll start throwing stones at you and there may be confrontation. So you can't pick that area. So in many cases, protection of the Palestinians means keeping them out of their own olive groves, because
so that
they
won't get hurt.
So they won't, right. So it's a strange form of protection. Of course, we saw many olive trees that have been cut down by the settlers, and actually the place where we were first going to go to pick, there had been a lot of olives stolen the previous night by settlers. So we couldn't go there. In any case, and of course in Hebron, that's a terrible situation.
There are about, what, 400 or 500 Israeli settlers in the middle?
Well, yeah, they have some large settlements. Kiryat Arba is one of the oldest settlements there. Beit Romano, and right now the other settlement name leaves me, but these are 2 settlements right in Hebron. And I mean, you see a situation where actually the Israeli Defense Forces have put up screening over the streets. So the Israeli settlers, they throw all their garbage out the windows onto the Palestinians. They throw the dirty diapers out and all this. And this is to protect the people underneath who are walking in the streets in the old part of Hebron.
So the rubbish is retained by these meshes or something?
Yeah, that's the idea. And you see people's agricultural fields that, in order to have a security barrier around the settlements, and the settlements are typically up on the hill once again, they confiscate land. So, for example, the family that we stayed with that live on the outskirts of Hebron, a family that has had their house bulldozed twice by the Israeli Defense Forces. The second time, the wife miscarried. She can't get pregnant anymore. One of the daughters went up a tree with a rope, was going to hang herself. I mean, these are common stories, but when you read about them, it's one thing. But when you're there and you see how traumatized families are, it's something else. But in any case, more than half of their vineyards, they can't access them because now it's part of the security barrier. and part of the family lives on one side of the of the settler highway. Another part of the family lives on the other side of the settler highway. They can cross the highway to go back and forth to one another, but they can't drive on that highway. It's restricted for settlers. When we were, and you see the racist graffiti that the settlers have marked on all of the, not all of them, but certainly in the old section of Hebron, on the Palestinian shops, and most of the shops have closed now. They've been driven out by the settlers.
And it's only like 400 or 500 settlers or more, or
I don't
in
know.
the middle of the of Hebron.
In the middle of Hebron, yeah, it's not more than that, but on surrounding it, and it's actually quite difficult to get exact numbers on the settlers
right.
because they are often inflated. Many times people don't want to stay. I mean, if we're talking about the entirety of the West Bank, we're talking about, with the excluding East Jerusalem. If we exclude East Jerusalem, we're talking about close to 200,000 settlers. And it was interesting when I was there. We asked how many of these people are Americans, American Jews who've come, and we were told like over 70%, and we were shocked. Now, some people dispute those figures, but even that, it's a difficult figure to get a handle on because they're already in the third generation of settlers. So if the first ones came from Brooklyn or wherever they might have come from, Chicago, that, you know, but now that they're their grandchildren already. Well, are their grandchildren Israelis?
Or
are they Palestinians?
Or dual citizenship? Or triple citizenship or something.
I don't know, but it's I mean, you could see the violence all over. The night that we were in Hebron, there was a military action right where 5 members of our group of 10 were staying. Over 100 IDF troops came. Automatic weapons were being fired all over the place. They actually had the father of the man whose apartment they were staying in out on the street. They stripped him completely naked. Were using him as a human shield as they were going around to apartments, dragging people out of their apartments. Did anybody know why they were doing this? No. But this is a typical type of thing that goes on. People say, well, they could have been searching for somebody, or they could have been trying to intimidate everybody so that somebody turns is willing to become an undercover.
All these are rationalization excuses.
But
the thing is that
I mean, horrible situation.
Those things you don't see on the mainstream media, you know, or anything of the sort. What I'm gonna do is like show a map of the partition of Palestine in 1947 to give some idea for our viewers as to what are we talking about, you know, now what's the origin of this conflict, etc. We're not going to go back way back except to 1947. And to show the two kinds of states that the UN had said that this would be the partition plan, and it was voted on. And then maybe like Ramses would like to comment on the map. So when it's ready, we can show the map. So could you just tell us something about it, Ramses, about the partition?
Well, in actual fact, when the problem got to a head in 1947, and the whole world was supporting the Israelis for establishment of their state on Palestinian land, the United Nations decided to divide the land of historical Palestine between the two contestants, or the two sides, and they gave the Israeli state about 54% of the historical land of Palestine, and the rest, which is 44%, was given to the Arabs, although at that time the Arabs were 3 times, their numbers were 3 times those of the Palestinians. 150,000 the Arab population, while the Israeli or the Jewish population was at that time 50,000. So of course the Arabs at that time felt that they were not sort of given a just piece of the pie.
Yeah, you mean like 1.5 million and...
Yes, yes,
yeah,
I'm
and
sorry.
500,
I'm sorry,
1,000,
1.5
yeah.
million and half a
Yeah,
million.
half a
That's
million,
right.
yeah, that's
My
right.
mistake.
Yeah, that's okay.
And so the Arabs felt that they were, you know, very unjustly treated, and they are the majority by 3 to 1, and they were given less land than what was given to the Jews.
Yeah.
So of course this caused the first war,
Yeah.
1948, when the other Arab countries tried to intervene and stop these processes.
Yeah, it might be interesting to note that, in fact, even in the Israeli areas, there would have been more Arabs residing there than there are Jews. You know?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing,
Yeah.
that they were given like 55% of that. I want to show another map, which is land occupied in 1967 by the Israelis also. So if it's ready, the map, we can show that. Just to give a comparison, a lot of those areas, like where the West Bank and Gaza, they were taken over by the Israelis in 1967. And also the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria, and also the Egyptian Sinai. Since 1978, I believe, Egypt retained, got back the Sinai. And the Golan Heights are still occupied, so is the West Bank, and so is the Gaza Strip. So just to give an idea that all of historic Palestine now is occupied, plus other lands, including the Golan Heights. So this is part of the problem here, in the sense that even the West Bank and the Gaza have been settled. And have you been to Israeli settlements or around them? Or yeah. So could you talk about that?
You mean, I'm not sure if I understand the question. The settlements in the territories? You mean?
Yeah, occupied territories.
Well, we actually did not go into the settlements. We only saw the settlements. And like I was saying before, they occupy usually the high ground, and then there's the security barriers, and in many cases they are pushing the Palestinians out of their own land.
So you couldn't go into the settlements, or you didn't?
We tried
want
to. No. We had tried to arrange some meetings with some settlers, but
they didn't want to.
They weren't interested.
They weren't
in
interested in rabbis for peace. Huh?
Well, I mean, the group that we were there with was a group called Promoting Enduring Peace.
Okay.
But they were not interested in meeting with us. But it's, I mean, you can see the settlements very clearly because they're behind fences, you know, and there's a separation barrier between where the settlements are and where the Palestinians live.
Yeah. I want to show another super to show how land control changed, you know, since 1947. And it's a graph. It's just like revealing the graph. So when we're ready, we can show the graph. See how Palestinians have lost land since, okay, so the yellow is Palestinian land, well, yellow-green, and the red is Israeli. So that's 1947. And then you go 1967, it has shrunk very much, so that it is like 22% of the entire Palestine. And then after that...
Can I
yeah,
intervene here?
Sure.
Now, the first pie chart on the left-hand side is showing the partition plan.
Yeah,
the percentage of land given to the Arabs, that's the green, and the percentage of land given to the Israelis, that's the red. Now, by the end of 1949, the Israelis, during the war of 48, managed to control not only what they were given, which is 54%, but they controlled the 78% of the land, taking over land with very, very congested Palestinian populations. And they depopulated the villages, about 400 or more, over 400 villages were depopulated. And of course, these people that were living in those villages, the Arabs, were driven out, and they formed the first wave of immigrants or refugees that had to leave their villages, either go to Jordan or
Palestine,
to Palestine,
Syria,
yeah, to Palestine
Egypt,
itself, other places in Palestine. Now, after that, the other part of the chart shows the 1967 war, where the area that was green is now striped with red. That's they occupied the 22% that were left for the Palestinians. Israel occupied them. So since that time, they have been occupying that land up till this moment.
Yeah.
So
that gives you an idea of the progression of occupation and so on. And much of that is in violation of international law, etc. You have seen those violations, I mean, on a daily basis in your recent trip. Yeah. Just to give us another idea about what's happening, there is Frederick Bush, whom we know. He came here and spoke early this year, I think February or March. March. And he gave a talk at the University of Hawaii. So we're going to play a segment of that. It's about Israel and the Israeli leadership. He has a good idea about this, to give us an idea about what's going on more recently. Yeah. So when the tape is ready, we will watch that and then we can comment on it.
Proceeded to do everything possible to create such facts on the ground as to make this result virtually impossible. The supposition is that Israel would be slowly withdrawing from the West Bank in particular. However, in point of fact, quite the opposite was taking place. During the 5 years of the Oslo Interim Accords, the number of Israeli settlements increased by 50%. They were supposed to be withdrawing. And the total number of Jewish settlers in the West Bank doubled. West Bank and East Jerusalem doubled from 200,000 to 400,000. Secondly, what the Palestinians experienced on the ground and in their daily lives during the Oslo period led them to conclude, and I believe rightly so, that the so-called Oslo peace process, however it began and whatever its intentions were on the part of the leaders that were then in charge, notably Yitzhak Rabin, who we'll remember later was assassinated, however it began, had become simply an Israeli mechanism to prolong and indeed make permanent the status quo of an oppressive occupation, with its ever-expanding settlements and bypass roads. The map you have here shows the bypass roads that were built by the Israelis during the Oslo process, during the 5 years, designed to bypass all the Palestinian areas of occupation and connect the settlements with Israel proper and with one another. These bypass roads are security roads, so the road itself is very wide and very well built. It has security on each side of the order of about a football field. So Israel built, during the Oslo process, some 250 miles in the West Bank, an area about the size of Delaware, that were 4 football fields wide, and you can see how they chopped up the area the Palestinians lived in, the shaded area on the map, into these isolated enclaves. To this was added dozens and dozens of checkpoints and restriction of movement, and finally, because of all this, the complete collapse of the Palestinian economy with the resulting severe unemployment and extreme poverty.
Well, just to give the viewers a better idea, we have a map that we want to show, and it's from 1999, West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1999. So when it's ready, we'll show it, and we can then comment on that, because that's what, this is better. Would George or Ramses?
Well, I think what this map shows
that's
is...
the Palestinian state?
Well, that's what has at times been proposed as a Palestinian state, and the supposedly generous peace offer made when Barak was Prime Minister of Israel. When one looks at what was actually offered to the Palestinians at that, it has been described as cantons. Basically, it's even the West Bank was divided into three sectors, and travel from any one portion of it to another was absolutely controlled by Israel, by the Israeli military. So the notion that this could be a viable state is pretty much a joke. Some people say that this was the best offer that Israel ever made. That may be true.
Yeah, but
whether anything that the Palestinians have been offered by Israel could be considered a basis for a viable sovereign state, I don't think that anybody would make that case. I mean, first of all, Gaza is completely separated from the West Bank. The West Bank is divided into multiple sections which are isolated from one another by these security settler roads, by the Israeli settlements. It's an impossible situation.
It's like leopard spots, and how can you have a viable state?
Samia Khoury, when she was visiting recently
from Jerusalem.
From Jerusalem, she said what is called the peace platter, the generous offer, is just a platter of pieces.
That's
it's
right.
Not a peace platter at all.
Yeah. So let's play another segment from Fred Bush's same talk at the UH. And he's talking about why Palestinians continue with acts of revenge, as he called it. So we'll watch that and then we can comment on it.
Why Palestinian extremists continue such indefensible acts of revenge when it is clear that the policy has badly harmed the Palestinian cause in all respects, especially here in the United States and especially with the current American administration. The first of these is perhaps obvious from what I've already said, and that is the realities of life for Palestinians under the occupation. As an example, let me consider what the Palestinians endured during the first 2 months of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. In an article published in the right-wing Israeli daily newspaper, Ma'ariv, on September the 6th, 2002, the right-wing Israeli journalist, Ben Caspit, wrote as follows: "For many years, the IDF had been preparing for this intifada. And when it interrupted, the IDF is the Israeli Defense Forces, the army, and when it erupted, the army released its prolonged frustration on the Palestinians who did not know what hit them. To illustrate this fact, he told the following story. About 3 weeks after the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, General Amos Malka asked the district intelligence officer, 'Tell me, how many bullets has the army fired since the beginning of the Intifada?' The man had no idea, so Malka asked him to find out. When the answer arrived around noon, most of the officers who were present, according to an eyewitness, turned white. In the first 3 weeks of the Intifada, the Israeli army fired about 700,000 bullets and other shells and projectiles in the West Bank, and about 300,000 in Gaza. All told, about 1 million bullets and other projectiles were used. Someone in the Central Command later quipped that the project should be named A Bullet for Every Child."
Well, I mean, that gives you an idea about the state of affairs and the things that Palestinians endure on a daily basis. And
add something that one of the major histories that's been written of Israel, it's a history by Benny Morris. And he's considered the dean of the modern so-called revisionist Israeli historians. And he's, once again, by no means a liberal. He has pretty much, last January, I think, in an interview in Haaretz, pretty much came out and said, well, it may be necessary that we have ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the territories eventually. He didn't say that he was sure of that, but he thought maybe.
Maybe we should do that.
But in his history, which is entitled Righteous Victims, which the New York Times called the most comprehensive history of the Holy Land. And it covers the period from the end of the 19th century up until 2001. On page 300 and something, I can't remember the exact page, but he actually says, the notion of civil disobedience for Palestinians in the territories is an impossibility. And he catalogs all of the practices of the Israeli Defense Forces in basically making protest, peaceful protest, an impossibility. And that this has been the case ever since before the Al-Aqsa
Intifada, yes.
Intifada. So this has been the case for probably close to 25 years.
Right.
Because people sometimes forget that the so-called territories, the Palestinian territories, those areas that were conquered by Israel in the '67 war and have since been administered by Israel, they are under military administration. This is not a civilian administration. This is military rule. There are no rights. And sometimes people are able to get a case up to the Supreme Court of Israel, and sometimes there are some reversals, but then they can't even get the cases enforced by the authorities, because if the army doesn't want to do it, nothing gets done.
We should point out, just for our viewers, that the Al-Aqsa Intifada was the second uprising, and it started in September 2000, and it's ongoing despite all the killings.
But civil disobedience has been impossible since the early 1970s. I mean, basically, ever since the military administration came in there. And if any of the viewers have ever lived in a situation under military administration, they know that there's almost nothing you can do. You have no rights.
Yeah, and we often speak about Palestinians losing their land in the West Bank and Gaza, but we also have to say that Arabs who are Israeli Arabs who never left Palestine when the State of Israel was created in 1948, they were living under military rule until the 60s, in fact, and also much of their land had been confiscated to make way for Israeli settlements of Israeli Jews.
Actually, if I could add something to that, one thing that actually I did not realize how extensive this was until my recent trip.
Right.
In some cases, now of course there were 700,000 Palestinians who left what became Israel during that 48-49 period. And when the Freedom of Information Act opened up certain Israeli records, we found out that, yes, most of them were driven out by the Israelis. They did not leave of their own free will. But in many cases, the Israeli army came to the Palestinian village and simply informed them, everybody come to the center of the village, and then they put them into trucks and they simply dropped them off in the countryside someplace. And so that's how many Palestinians lost their land. Some of them have come back since then. You know, gone to court to try to get their land back. And even when they have won in court, they can't get any administration to enforce those orders. And one thing we did see today, even today, Palestinians are being squeezed out within Israel. We went to a number of Palestinian villages, and these are villages where Palestinians that used to live in a much larger area were driven in. Their lands were taken away from them. And what happens there is something of the same thing that's happening in the territories today. The Israeli government builds new settlements for the immigrants who come in from Russia or wherever. And they build these settlements on the hills around where all of the Palestinians have been squeezed into one small area. The Palestinians don't get any rights to expand their community. So where are the children going to go? They have no place to live. But meanwhile, the settlements for the Israelis, that is for the Israeli Jews, encircle them and cut them off completely. So, there is a type of, there is certainly not equal civil rights within Israel today.
So that's what I mean. There's racism against the Israeli Arabs, so-called Israeli Arabs.
Absolutely.
There's racism practice and discrimination and the rest of it. So in this way, you can't really talk about an Israeli democracy, you know, with equal rights for all citizens. You wanted to say.
It's an oxymoron to say that Israel is a democracy because it's a Jewish state. How can you put Jewish and democracy at the same time? Because there are 1/5 of the population of Israel
are Christians and Muslims.
Are Christian and Muslim Arabs. And these have no rights. They are second or third class citizens. So how can you say that Israel is a democracy? It's impossible. When you say a Jewish state, that means that the two, terms conflict with each other.
Right.
They are contradictory. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out is that this, George and Brahim have been mentioning the role of the army, the IDF.
Yeah.
And of course, Fred Bush mentioned that
Yeah, in
at
fact,
length.
yeah, we're gonna.
Yes, and he said that since quite a few years ago, it's the army that is in control of the government.
Yes.
Since Barack, or even before Barack, there were only generals, and it's a revolving door policy where generals go into the cabinet, and then they go out of the cabinet and go into the army again, and so on. And Warshawski, Michel Warshawski, has mentioned this very clearly in one of his articles that he wrote recently, saying that actually there was a military coup in Israel in 1996, where the army is in complete control of all the politics.
Yeah. That's a good one. In fact, in this one segment, we're going to watch Frederick Bush again, talking about Sharon and his role, in the government. And Sharon is a general, right? Yeah. So we play that, and then we talk some more about it. Yeah.
The major goal of the Sharon government has been to completely destroy what the Oslo process had produced. Sharon openly declared this in October 2001, and his statement was quoted in the Haaretz newspaper on October the 18th. Quote, "Oslo is not continuing. There won't be Oslo. Oslo is over." The eradication of Oslo by Sharon's military government had two aspects. One, the destruction of the Palestinian Authority and the societal and commercial institutions of the developing Palestinian state, and two, the military reoccupation of the whole West Bank, in particular Area A, the orange area on the map, which was the area in which the state was being developed, because it was totally under the control of the Palestinian National Authority.
Yeah, so if you destroy the infrastructure of whatever Palestinian Authority there might be, I mean, how do you say that you are going for negotiations for peace?
Well, the irony is that while they were destroying the Palestinian Authority and the infrastructure of the Palestinian society as a whole, they were blaming the Palestinian Authority for not managing to stop the violence, while the Palestinian Authority became completely impotent. They had no control on anything. And Arafat was incarcerated in his headquarters in Ramallah, and I mean, he had no way to control what's happening.
The Palestinians should have said, you also stop the violence by the Israeli settlers. I mean, presumably civilians, but armed civilians. But it's interesting, now like there's the notion of going out of Gaza, pulling out of Gaza, the Israelis. So I interviewed Elton Daniel, he's a professor of history here, and he talked about that. So we'll watch that and then we can open it up,
If you look at it from a rational point of view, pulling out of Gaza is literally the least you can do. I mean, that should be a no-brainer. Why would you want to hold on to settlements in an area as difficult as that? It's an invitation for attacks. It's an enormous expense. It's a huge problem. And yet there's this fierce opposition to giving up even an inch of Gaza. So if you have that kind of resistance, even to something as straightforward in many ways as Gaza, what's going to happen when you start talking about Jerusalem and the West Bank? It's hard, as I say, to be optimistic about any of it.
Yeah, we're talking about, how the opposition from right-wing Israelis, and there's a majority of them now, to Gaza. So, the idea is, how can you have peace if you don't, if you're not willing to pull out of Gaza, which is like hell for the Israelis, So, George, or
you want to say something, George?
Well, one can imagine why some parties in Israel want to get rid of Gaza because many people have heard of the demographic question that the land currently under control by Israel, we're talking about the Palestinian territories and the area controlled by Israel before 67, that it's estimated that by approximately the year 2020, within that area there will be more Palestinians, that is Muslims, Christians, and others, than Jews. And at which point, if there's to be any pretense at democracy any longer, you know, just through voting, that's aside from the fact that they have no constitution or basic law of the land, that demographically there will be a minority of Jews at that point. And this is something I think that has terrified many people in Israel because, of course, their dream was to have a Jewish state. And so getting rid of Gaza at this point is like getting rid of over 1 million people. It buys time for Israel. Also, Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It has no economy. Because the government infrastructure was destroyed. I mean, you have a lot of gangsters there basically now. You also have some with good intentions, but it's a pretty crazy place. But even in that situation, you have the Orthodox, greater Zionist parties and individuals in Israel who they have this vision of, at a minimum, Israel will be this land from the Jordan to the sea. And so Israel is afraid of these people. Let's not forget that they killed Rabin. They're terrorists. And unfortunately, they get support from all kinds of people. For example, I saw a travel brochure that came to my house from the Chabad organization in Hawaii, whose rabbi is the spiritual advisor of our governor. But, and in this, part of the tour is to go to the beautiful beaches in Gaza, next to the settlements there. And this is, of course, by armored bus. But this is, of course, is part of the building support for retaining these settlements there, for not giving you know, a centimeter, a millimeter. Don't give anything. And so this, and of course Sharon can, if he actually tries to move these settlers out there by paying them $200,000 apiece so that they can buy an apartment in Israel proper, well, of course, he then looks like the great peacemaker. But getting Gaza has nothing to do with peace. It's getting rid of a problem for Israel. It's getting rid of this demographic problem. And then what Israel says, well, we get rid of Gaza, but then we're going to hold on definitely to the settlements in the West Bank and perhaps expand them, maybe close down some outposts, but you know, we'll make up for it in the West Bank.
And bring settlers from Gaza to the West Bank, probably.
Can I?
Sure.
Weinglass, he is an advisor to Sharon. And he made, in an interview, he made a statement which is horrifying. When they asked him, what about the Gaza withdrawal, or withdrawing from Gaza, the project that Sharon has been talking about so much, and the extreme right wing were against it and so on. He said, this is exactly like putting formaldehyde on the peace process. That is means killing the peace process. And killing the peace process means killing any hope or possibility of actually establishing a Palestinian state. So this is an important person in the government of Israel who is advisor to Sharon himself, is saying something like that. So it is just as George said, they wanted to get rid of Gaza anyway because it represents a terrible danger for them down the road. But at the same time, they want to cling to the settlements in the West Bank and annex as much land in the West Bank as they can. So
go
a free
ahead.
hand in the West Bank.
Elton Daniel, another segment from that, he talks about Arafat after Arafat. So we'll watch that and comment.
I sort of have the feeling that now that Arafat is actually gone, some of the people who wish that he were gone would wish he were back, because it's hard for me to see that there's really anybody left on the Palestinian side who would have the stature and the authority to make an agreement that wouldn't be challenged immediately by somebody else. And on top of that, as you sort of suggested, you have what seems to be a good deal of political infighting that's breaking out. There's this talk, of course, that the PLO and the Fatah, they want to maintain unity. They don't want to show any signs of dissent or splits in the movement, but clearly they are there, and they reflect pretty big questions in the overall issue. And so you have challenges to Abbas from two men who both happen to be named Barghouti coming at him from opposite sides of the spectrum in some ways, and I really don't know how that's going to play out. But I can very well see that lots of Palestinians, just out of frustration, would want to vote for Barghouti. And then what do you do? If you say you want democracy, you have democracy, and so you elect somebody who's sitting in jail. It's going to be an interesting thing to see how it plays out, but I really don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem. Barghouti, he announced that he was running, and then he announced that he wasn't, and now was, and then now wasn't. You know, so he's out of the picture, presumably. We don't know. But what I want to do is play another segment from Elton. It's very short, 57 seconds, and then we'll comment on that.
You know, you sort of get the feeling now, from what you hear at least coming out of it, both on the sort of the PLO, the general Palestinian side, and also specifically on the side of Hamas, that you're just up against such an overwhelming force with Bush in the White House, Sharon in Israel, this willingness in the war on terrorism to use any kinds of means to crush opposition, that it's just such a hopeless task that you have to come to some sort of arrangement to preserve what little you have left. And in the case of thinking long term, it means, you know, maybe like with the Crusades, not today, but 50 years from now or 100 years from now, maybe we can think about different solutions. But what you do now in the face of the realities that exist, very difficult.
Yeah, both segments were about Palestinian politics in terms of who's gonna like succeed Arafat and what would be the strategy in terms of dealing with the Israelis as well, something that we'll be talking more about. So, but any ideas about what Elton was saying? George?
I agree. I mean, there's been this sort of euphoria. Well, Arafat is gone. Now we can get on with the peace process. But that is, in my opinion, that's based completely on a fiction.
Yes.
I mean,
the roadmap fiction is one of them.
The roadmap fiction. Also, that Arafat was the stumbling block to peace. There are many who I spoke to, Israeli Jews, who they thought Arafat sold the Palestinian people out by signing Oslo to begin with, because actually people said, oh, Oslo, now there'll be peace. But if you read chapter and verse of Oslo, the prospect of having a truly sovereign, independent Palestinian state under Oslo was non-existent. Now, of course, as a result of that, the Israeli government would deposit the taxes that they collected that were supposed to go to the Palestinian Authority. They would deposit that directly in Arafat's personal account. And then they would accuse Arafat of being corrupt, so he gets all this money. I mean, it's all craziness. But the notion that that things will change now, I mean, there is no evidence of any willingness to change on the part of the dominant parties in Israel. And that includes labor, because let's not forget that when labor ran, Shimon Peres, you know, and his crew were running Israel. The settlements continued to expand. All the violence against the Palestinians, and so the likelihood that there will be any change, and the settlements are expanding today.
Right.
So we see no real movement on the part of the Israelis. All we see is demands from the Israelis that the Palestinians must stop this and they must stop that. And it has actually we haven't touched on the suicide bombings. And there's all kinds of things that can be said, but that has become, from what I could see and from what one reads, that has become the excuse of the Israelis to say, well, if they're going to practice terrorism against us, forget it. That's the last straw. I mean, whether the you don't. I mean, it's easy to condemn terrorism. Whether the Palestinians have had any other outlet to express their outrage, and of course we forget that how many presidents of Israel have been convicted terrorists. I mean, the guy who today runs Israel, Sharon, you know, he's a convicted war criminal. So. I mean, it all depends who's got the power. I mean, so, but this has become the great excuse for much of supposedly liberal Israel to simply opt out.
Yeah, that's why, like Frederick Bush was talking about the acts of revenge, etc. And then, you know, this terrorism has to be condemned, whether it's Palestinian terrorism, suicide bombing, etc., or Israeli terrorism with F-15s, etc. But to complicate matters further, I'm going to show a map of the wall. And I'd like Ramses and you also, because you've seen not the wall, but the quote-unquote fence, which is part of the wall.
The wall is a term that means the whole security.
So here it is, the wall. Could you just walk us through it, so to speak, not through the wall, but parallel to it, shall we say?
As you see, the West Bank is the dark green area with the yellow patches in it. And as you see on the right-hand side, there is the line coming into the Dead Sea. That's the Jordan River. This line represents the green line, which is mentioned so frequently as the sort of line that demarcates the West Bank. And it goes around on the other side, you know, the western side, and inside towards Jerusalem and out again. So these two blocks constitute the West Bank. Now, the wall, which is, you know, claimed by Israel as the separation wall, and most Palestinians call it the apartheid wall, or the imprisonment wall, instead of being built on the limits between Israel on this side, the light green area, and the West Bank, it goes into the West Bank itself. So Israel is actually building the wall, separating different parts of Palestine itself, the Palestinian territories. So how can, if we are having, I mean, I'm your neighbor, and you are disgusted with my actions and behavior, you want to make a separation wall between you and me. You come into my land and build a separation wall?
That's,
Of course.
So that's, I'm saying that's like complicating matters further in terms of that.
And you see what's happening, as George has just mentioned a few minutes ago, this wall divides the West Bank, what is left of the West Bank, on top of the divisions that, you know, has splintered it into little niches or cantons. It divides it into 3 areas, which are going to be completely separate from one another, and controlled by Israeli checkpoints. So how can you imagine that such a structure made of 3 splintered areas, each of them is splintered and sub-splintered, how can you imagine that this is going to be a viable state?
So I asked Elton Daniel also about, you know, to put it in the context of the region, what's happening here. So we'll watch that and then we can comment on it, and on the wall as well.
Saudi situation is a big question mark. Mubarak in Egypt is not going to live forever. You have to question what happens in Egypt once that regime is gone. Jordan, I don't know. They're not in a very strong position either. This new king is not like the old king and hasn't really been tested that much yet. We don't know how that would work out. Iraq is a disaster any way you look at it. Every day it looks like it's closer and closer to an all-out civil war there that's going to break out. Iran, politically, you've got struggle still going on there. And then on top of all of that, you have what's probably the biggest question mark of all is what really is the intention of the Bush administration with the Middle East? What really is on their agenda? And, you know, people who've been trying to put sort of a good spin on the last election think, well, you know, they've probably seen the errors of their ways and they'll change and they're going to try to heal some of the problems that exist in that region. Maybe, but you can make just a plausible case that they're already plotting the next wars. And the only question is it going to be Syria or is it going to be Iran? But they're going to go after somebody, and the situation just gets more and more volatile and precarious every day. Powell is gone, and Rice, you know, and her subordinate now have been promoted up. Rumsfeld, supposedly reluctantly, is staying on. I mean, the whole crowd, everyone who is responsible for the biggest blunders is still there. And they're all people with a track record of not being at all interested in solving something like the problem between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, the Bush administration is full of people who opposed the Oslo Accords, who did everything they could to sabotage them. Why would they now suddenly want to, you know, resurrect these things? I don't see it happening.
We have a few more minutes yet, and we have a caller, Robert from Pearl City. So, Robert, you're on the air.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'd like to ask this question, and it's hypothetical. Bush, of course, and the quartet have pushed the roadmap. Initially, there was going to be a viable Palestinian state in 2005. I understand that has now moved up to 2009. My question is this. If the Palestinians, the Christians and Muslims of Palestinians and the Jews of Israel, if they are to get together in peace and reconciliation, can you gentlemen predict that if the roadmap plays out and that, say, by 2009, Palestine becomes a state in the Bantustans that they have, 10 years after 2009 or 15 or 20 years after that, can you believe the resistance to that situation will end and that there will be peace and reconciliation in the area? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, but you know, it's hard for me to imagine, given the context of the region, as Elton Daniel was talking about it. So, any ideas about that?
Well, you know, if I would, you know, try to sort of make some guessing to answer Robert's question, I am very pessimistic about the whole situation. I don't think that Israel, as it, I mean, the power that is, or the group of Israelis that are in power now at present, have no intention of going on with the peace process.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's going to be any process of peace unless Israel is forced by the international powers to stop the occupation and sort of get out of the West Bank. And this, I mean, imposing a peace process from outside.
Yeah. So I want to go also to Elton Daniel, continuing on with talking about the region, and then we'll talk a little bit about Israeli divestment later on, because I think, or divestment from Israel as a pressure point, you know, against Israeli policies and so on. So we go to Elton Daniels, and then we can discuss all those.
This is deja vu. We've seen much of this before, and the parallels between the situation with the United States and Iraq is remarkably similar to the situation between the British and Iraq earlier on, and I think even more so to the British in Egypt. And one of the things, when the British occupied Egypt in 1882, the question came up in the world community, what are you doing there? how long you're going to be there. And of course, the answer was always, we're there to help Egypt get back on its feet, and we're not going to stay a day longer than we have to. We want to leave right away. This would come up in Parliament. People would ask the government, how long are you going to be there? When are you leaving? As soon as we have order, Egypt's back on its feet, we leave. And they said that every year for 40 years. And if you look at the case of Iraq, I mean, we hear the same kind of talk. We only go in for the most noble of purposes. We're only going to help the Iraqis get back on their feet and have a decent government. We want nothing for ourselves, and we're leaving. But when you look at what's going on, the biggest American embassy in the world is being built in Iraq. And I think 14 bases, something like that, that are being developed and expanded there. Everything you see makes it appear that the idea is to turn Iraq into a permanent base for U.S. forces in the region, not to have them based in Saudi Arabia. Maybe that helps, with the situation there, one of bin Laden's complaints, but it's going to be right there in the heart of things. So, I mean, here again, the question comes up, for reasons that mystify me, the Bush administration is absolutely insistent that they have elections in Iraq by January the 30th. It's saying we've got to have democracy among the Palestinians, but there's not much thought given to suppose the Palestinians elect the candidate they want instead of the candidate that you want. Same thing in Iraq. Suppose they have the elections, they find somebody, probably a Shiite. He says, thank you very much, now leave. Then what?
Yeah, that's like if you want to separate Palestine from Iraq and other things in the region, this is unrealistic. I mean, that's the idea. Things are, talking about you being pessimistic. Yeah. I mean, there is a real material reason for this pessimism because, the Americans and the Israelis are playing with fire in the area and thinking that they are maintaining a certain kind of posture and, foreign policy and domination of Middle East, etc. But now we are Americans here, and we want to try and influence in a democratic manner our policy. Our American policy. And as people, what can we do?
Well, I think we can, of course, try to educate ourselves. But one question I tried to ask everybody I met with: how can we influence this situation? Because all the people I met with, Israelis included, except for those who said it's them or us, it's a fight to the death, all of the others said the settlements and the territories are an unmitigated disaster for Israel. It's destroying our society too. The militarism, all this, the resultant suicide bombings. So I said, well, what do you think of divestment campaigns? And they said, in terms of divesting any investments in companies that assist the settlements in any way whatsoever, they invest in the settlements, they sell things to the settlements, anything like that. They said, absolutely, we are all for that type of divestment. And that is the type of divestment that the Protestant Church has just approved on a limited basis. That is the type of investment that the Church of England and the Episcopal Church are talking about today. So I think that would be a good move in the right direction. And I know it would be welcomed by many of the people in Israel as pressure to get the Israeli settlements out of the territories, because so long as that exists, there will never be any peace.
Yeah, of course, there's the other thing that Israelis and pro-Zionists will say, oh, this is anti-Semitism, but I mean, this kind of red herring has to stop. Yeah, has to stop. And then we're almost out of time, so I thank you for sharing your ideas with us, and thanks our viewers for spending some time with us. Mahalo, and see you next year.
Next year, right.